Hi everyone. Thanks for coming to my talk. I'm Shawn Wallis. I'm head of threat modeling at PayPal, and my talk's titled "Threat Modeling in a Crypto Haunted World." I do not have a book. This is just a Photoshop of a Carl Sagan book, but I thought it was very fitting. So, let's see. I'm a DEF CON goon, Black Hat volunteer. So I've been in the community a while. Advisor to Silent Push, which is a DNS security and Interby company, and live in the San Francisco Bay Area. Disclaimer. The talk's going to go over today a lot. We're going to start out talking about what threat modeling is, some very basics, and then get into some fun stuff talking about cryptocurrency and the threats that happen there. I'll try to really cover stuff that's unique to cryptocurrency and not stuff that maybe overlap with your basic security things, and then kind of wrap it up about why all this matters and what I learned going through this for cryptocurrency. So as you see here, really the importance of threat modeling is really to help identify priorities. That's what I do in my job. I identify what should we prioritize on and what should we solve, where should we spend our money, what is not okay, what is okay, let's focus over here. To do that, it really has a large communication aspect of that. Working with teams, partnering with teams, understanding what they do, understanding the threats, identifying those threats, and then really putting this all together. So I like it. I think this is one of the jobs in InfoSec that is on the skyrise. Everyone is now investing in threat modeling, and that's kind of why I came to do it. I thought it was a pretty exciting thing, and I get to understand and see all the threats as they come in, which is pretty fun. The main focus of threat modeling really is about the shift left mentality. And the reason this is important, if you look at how we do security where everything's after deployment, you pass so many things. If you're identifying vulnerabilities after deployment, you're spending time developing vulnerabilities, you're spending time testing vulnerabilities, you're spending time deploying them, then your red team's testing them, right? Now, let's say a hacker finds them or bug bounty finds them. Now you got to go reinvest fixing that, creating tech debt. And think of all the ROI that you're saving is if you can move that and say, well, let's find and identify those vulnerabilities during that actual design phase. So that's where we're investing money to do that, to really kind of lower down the amount of vulnerabilities that we're putting out post-production. And that ROI pays for itself, meaning I can build a bigger team and we can deliver more secure product. So threat modeling in itself is very vague, just like threat hunting is. I was on a Pope's talk, and as he said that, it kind of really keyed into me, as it means a lot of things, but it's working with a lot of these teams, right? Risk assessments, threat assessments, red team, purple team, your bug bounty teams, your incident teams, taking all of this data in and really understanding what's valuable, leveraging them. They all have different focuses, and then that's why I feel like in threat modeling, it's really about that communication and that prioritization that's important. If you're able to kind of put that together, you're the hero for everyone. An example of this is for our crypto product, we went through 7, 8, 9 maybe different threat models, not threat models, but of these various assessments. And at the end, the CTO was of the cryptocurrency product was kind of frustrated and kind of threw his hands up, and he's like, wow, we did this 7, 8 assessments, and now all I have is a ton of tech debt that I need to go fix. And he looked at me and said, look, can you help prioritize? Tell me which ones are important, tell me which ones overlap, tell me what I need to go do. I took that as a win because out of all the teams, he came to our team and kind of said that. So I kind of went over some of these already, but things you really are looking out for. Too many cooks, too many people when you're doing 7, 8, 9 assessments on things, frustration's going to come in. That tech debt fatigue is coming in of like, wow, now you're creating more problems than solutions. Are you really helping me, right? And people start to lose credibility when you have too much of that fatigue. So in our case with cryptocurrency, you're dealing with new technology, many different SMEs, new processes, new regulations. One of the major issues I had with the SME area is every time I went to talk to somebody, they said, well, you need to go talk to so-and-so. And it was just this tree of 20 to 30 people that I kind of got to. So that was kind of frustrating. So there are several threat modeling frameworks out there. I'm not a really fan of any of them, but the one thing that I do like about them, like Stride here, is it gives you a check and balance for you to kind of go through and say, did I really think about each of these areas? Did I think about spoofing? Did I think about tampering, right? Do I need to look more or dig more into them? So that's really kind of how I leverage this, but I just kind of really want to make sure that I focus on real threats that people actually have executed or will execute against us in the future, and not those theory crafting or theoretical ones. Kind of the scope is a really big, important thing, and this will play into the next slides when I talk about threats. The reason is we rolled out cryptocurrency. So initially, I kind of looked at all threats of cryptocurrency, but we had a pretty narrow scope. We only had like 5 different currencies. We only had a couple different countries. We only had a couple different products we were launching. So I didn't necessarily need to get crazy and focus a lot on various type of attacks that maybe weren't really going to happen. So that's why the scope was really kind of important, because I could spend forever learning and being invested in what's going on in the cryptocurrency world. But I'm a technologist, and it's really more about focusing, kind of going deep when I need to, and then moving on to the next thing in my threat modeling portfolio. So cryptocurrency, what's different from like fiat currency or other just normal threats, right? Get a lot of new challenges, you get new threats, you get threats against blockchain, we'll get into all of those. A lot of it's irreversible. You make a purchase, and you can't reverse funds like you can with your banking account. Oh, they stole some money. Can you reverse that within that 3-day window or whatnot? It's anonymous, right? You actually steal money by hacking computers. A lot of people say, well, I can do that with a bank and whatnot. Well, the currency can just disappear on a computer, and I'll talk about some instances where that has happened. You have blockchains that fork, right, off to new ones. You have different attacks with that. And you have a very interesting dilemma with regulations, right? They're still being built on a year-by-year basis, and they're just not there like they are with your normal currency. So before I get to the next slide, just a disclaimer, if you're prone to dizziness, this one's a little active and a little fast-moving, or if you're also sensitive to overwhelming threats, you may want to look away. So the real intent of this slide is just kind of to give you some sense of the last many years of all the things that are coming to cryptocurrency, all the attacks and all the money that's getting lost and at speed. I remember there was one number that stood out that said 1 in 3 crypto exchanges have been hacked, right? And that's a huge number. The other interesting thing I find are these companies will come up and then disappear essentially overnight. They'll get hacked and they'll just dissipate. And then lawsuits happen. But because there are no regulations, because there's so much gray area, this is okay, right? And this is overwhelming, and this is why it's dangerous, and essentially why I'm here threat modeling it. So now we're going to kind of go into the various threats, which is pretty exciting. So I'll talk about some examples on each of these. Really, most importantly, is just kind of your architecture and kind of key management, right? This is one of those cases where you really need a multi-layer architecture. Put the things that need internet facing on the outer layer, and then start to build your layer inward of least trusting to most trusting, right? In a slide or two, we'll talk about various wallets, and you'll want your protected cold wallets on the inner layer while your hot wallets are more on the outer layer, right? So this is definitely not a 3 architecture architecture. You really need a three-tier architecture. You really will need those layers to kind of help protect you and protect you from this. Key management is very important. You don't want one person holding the keys. You really need to have various multi-factor in play for your admins to be able to move things, because guess what? Insider threats are real for cryptocurrency. They can just take that money, move it, and then disappear, right? Because they're moving hundreds of millions of dollars and just disappear from the country. They may be set for life, right, and move to somewhere that you don't even know. So logging is very important, so you can kind of track what's seeing, and it's going to help you build better controls. And when you understand, oh, I didn't realize that either we didn't have logs for this, or this didn't happen, or this wasn't supposed to happen this way, or let's come up with a better solution. Mentioning hot cold wallets, so I think of this more as like a wallet that's in your pocket, and then like a wallet that's maybe in your mattress or something, right? One of them's highly accessible, one of them's less accessible, right? How they use this in cryptocurrency is your hot wallet is the one you keep connected to the internet where you can access and exchange money, but your cold wallet is one that is kind of like your banking account, where you may have keys to it, you may have tokens, you may have it on a hardware token or whatnot, right? A hardware wallet with more access controls. So if building a thing, you really have to take this into consideration of who do you want to have keys? Do you want your admins to have the same keys? Do you want your third parties to do this? So you can kind of see how the threat vectors are different, right? One's facing the internet and the other one is entirely should not be facing the internet, but it may be connected to a third party and is definitely connected to your insiders. This is probably one of my favorite attacks because it leverages an old school attack. And the kind of the use case where this happened is one of the crypto exchanges published a SDK that had their crypto address in it. And somebody did a BGP hijack attack and just replaced the crypto address in that SDK. So guess where all the money started going? It started going to the hacker's wallet, right? And that was an amazing attack because it had literally almost nothing to do with crypto. All they did was an old school attack, and the company didn't realize or didn't even think that they needed to have extra protections to protect that. They invested a lot in the actual protection of how the application was built and things, but they didn't consider that just publishing that address was going to leave them at risk. DDoS attacks, a lot of these are really the same things you would normally think about, but there's a couple different things to consider. You know, your login is normal, right? Yeah, I could get DOSed and prevent people from logging in, but pricing works very differently with crypto, right? I know, for instance, I think we pull pricing like every 30 seconds or something of that nature, right? So it's changing very often. And if you DOS that pricing server, well, how does the application respond then? What does it do? Is it going to give you the last known one it did? Is it going to not produce your purchase, right? In those cases, those are very interesting things because you can game the system and may be able to come out ahead in that. If you can't talk to the blockchain, obviously you can't communicate. So that's a big deal. We haven't talked about custody providers, but a lot of companies will use a custody provider where they interact with the blockchain on your behalf. So that eliminates a lot of the risk from what your interaction with the blockchain and people faking transactions or attacking the blockchain. However, if you can't communicate with the blockchain or that third party, then obviously your system's going to be down. Then anti-fraud is very interesting too. So this works where you have sanctions busting or hackers or attackers that are trying to pass fraudulent money. And if you can't do those checks, well, how is your system going to respond? Is it not going to process? Is it going to fail open, fail close? So those are some different areas that you have to consider. So insider threats, like I said, cryptocurrency is irreversible. So once that money goes, there's no oops, no undo, right? So a lot of attacks have been insider threats who have figured this out. There weren't good controls in place, just passed money and then disappeared. So your basics with MFA and least privilege access, but you need to think about key sharding, keeping those keys separate, giving people only half access to things, or having them work with other people, right, to make things happen. Again, logging is very important on the insider threat area. Phishing BEC, it's interesting story here is, so for instance, we're PayPal. Yes, we're doing cryptocurrency. Yes, I've seen cryptocurrency phishing emails, but if I phish somebody through a cryptocurrency phishing email, I just get their credentials. And I can access their PayPal wallet. It doesn't matter if they're using cryptocurrency or not. I have their PayPal credentials, right? So that's an interesting thing that we've opened this attack vector where we're seeing more attacks coming, but it's giving access just to their normal wallets, not specifically to their cryptocurrency wallet. So that's something just to kind of think about of what am I bringing in or entailing just by adding cryptocurrency in. Blockchain. So I loved calling the 51% the Hollywood-esque, right? Because to pull this attack off, you know, if you have 100,000 people in the blockchain, you need 51,000 of them to kind of be on your side to pull over this, or adding 50, you know, another 51,000 nodes or whatnot to pull off a 51% attack, right? In doing this, you now can do things like double spending or rejecting transactions, things like that. Most of these attacks have happened on smaller blockchains. You know, there's always this growing worry of someone like China coming into the larger blockchains and just having the compute power to do this, but we necessarily haven't seen it except on some of those smaller blockchains. I think the max one was like 18 million that was stolen through a 51% attack with, I think, Bitcoin Gold. So that was pretty interesting, is that these can happen, but for instance, this kind of goes back to the mitigation of, for instance, why we only support like 5 coins. We kind of assessed that risk and said, are we picking coins that the risk is viable on this because of the size of the network, or do we feel comfortable and safe? So, smart contracts. So smart contracts basically are like little programs in these transactions that are kind of if-then clauses that says, if this happens or if this doesn't happen, then do this. Some of the fun attacks that happen with these are essentially bailing out of the transaction if conditions aren't met. So some of the other exchanges will start to process it and get so far, and then something will cause it to bail out, but that exchange will continue processing it. Now you kind of have funds on both ends. One of the major considerations is if you use like a crypto, a custody provider, let's say, they handle they're basically handing things over when everything's finished with the blockchain. So you don't really see those smart contracts affecting you as much because you're already being handed the money and you're not having to worry about those impacting you. Otherwise, it's definitely a very concerning thing if you are having to deal with smart contracts, and I would recommend a lot of good app security on that end. I mentioned custody providers, and again, custody provider is somebody interacts with the blockchain and whatnot on your behalf. So a lot of the threats are mitigated with that. You'll see a lot of companies that do that on behalf just to eliminate those threats. So that's pretty safe and pretty exciting from that perspective, right? But you have to consider, what if that custody provider gets DDoS attacked, right? What if there's insider threats from them coming into your network? Do you have the appropriate two-factor with them, right? And do they have more access into their network? We talked about those layers. Are they coming into that last layer, right, without control? So, and then is your software app security on those layers as good as it is on your internet-facing layers, right, where you may have various software defects that could allow those insider or third parties access. Now we'll move on to application threats. So really, a lot of it's just your standard security AppSec processes, right? Evasion processes and making sure that you're checking for things. A lot of the attacks that I researched and saw was really validation of saying, oh, I sent you 10,000 and really I'm sending you 100,000, right? Or vice versa, right? And the code not being smart enough to detect that these two fields weren't the same. So in this case, I recommend a lot of that validation and then revalidation of the server coming back to the client and saying, did you really send this? Did you really mean this, right? Because a lot of the attacks we see are trying to fake that, sending it one way. So if you have that two-way validation, it really is a good mitigation. Again, about your anti-fraud, right? Those anti-frauds are protecting you against money laundering, against sanction busting, so make sure that you don't have ways in your code that could bypass that, or you might have unchecked transactions which could result in fines and fees. So a new account fraud, right? So fraudulent accounts are always a problem, like maybe companies associated with a bluebird. So, but you know, in this case, you really need your controls to be kind of hardened to identify. I don't want a lot of people creating fake accounts and trying to push fraudulent monies, right? There are kind of things in place. There's been a lot of talk about in the industry about a company by the name of Chainalysis that can kind of do this. And the way they work is they tie basically people to money and say, yes, we know this cryptocurrency transaction or account was associated with a hack. And then they start to, okay, it forked off to these other accounts. Let's flag those accounts. So as that money moves around, it's a database now that you can go check and say, no, don't allow these transactions because we know those are fraudulent or associated with a hacked account or whatnot. Minting, I haven't talked about minting yet. So one of the more common attacks that I've seen, this is specific to crypto exchanges, is an exchange is where you're basically transferring one currency to the other. It's just your currency exchange, right? So a lot of hackers and fraudsters will use this to just kind of transfer money over. But these seem to be where the most attacks are done. Like I said, 1 in 3 exchanges have been hacked. And this is because the way this attack usually works is it says, oh, let me go exchange like 100 Bitcoin for Ethereum or whatnot, or even less known currency. And then as that transaction goes through, somehow, through a software defect or not, they cancel the transaction. However, it still goes through on the exchange and it refunds the money. So you just double spend, right? You got money on both ends. That's how the majority of these attacks seem to work, and the attackers just pad their pockets. So KYC controls, know your customer. So there was, interesting enough, as I was doing my threat model, there was a report came out at the same time, and KYC controls essentially are checking like your ID, as well as checking liveness to make sure you're alive, kind of anti-bot controls and making sure that you're not. This report basically said, yes, we can bypass them, right? And how that attack kind of works, right? Is you're submitting your ID here. And the problem is there are so many different IDs in the world, right? Oh, I'm using a passport from this. I'm using an ID from this. I'm using an ID from this state, right? How can the system has to be able to consume them all? And then the liveness check, it's just checking to see, hey, is this a live person and not a bot? But the problem with this is there's really no correlation between those two of saying, is that person on the liveness check the person in the ID? If you think about that, it's a really hard problem to even consider just with how things are. Like, what if it's a man and a woman, right? Maybe it's, what if I have a beard and now I don't have a beard, right? How do you account for that? So there are a lot of things that the software can't account for in that. So I think that's an area that is still in the industry being fine-tuned to kind of solve for. I actually talked about crypto exchange attacks in the other slide. So attackers kind of flock here because of this, right? For that. There's not much else to talk about. Minting, I kind of mentioned. Minting is when you're creating new currency. So a lot of this happens for stable coins, right? Where, hey, I'm exchanging so much Bitcoin or so much cash and minting new money in the crypto market. So a lot of these attacks are the same thing. If you can trick in here, you're creating digital currency, you're hacking through a computer now, right? And it is actually rather easy to do that. If you've seen the slide I went through a couple back, right, with the amount of times this has been done. But by using a custody provider, again, even with stablecoin, you're transferring all that liability over to them and you're insuring it. So this really kind of helps you, in our case, helped us from not having to worry about that and making sure that liability is covered. I spoke about kind of money laundering, sanction busting, right? Bad actors leverage this all the time. There's something called kind of peel chaining where they're going to make very small transactions, and they're also going to try to do race conditions where they're going to open so many addresses so fast that the system can't keep up with this. But you have to build in some delays to make sure that you're accounting for those checks, even with those limits, right? I think on the next slide I'll talk about trust, or yes. So this is something Coinbase has been driving. There's something called the travel rule in financials. And that's essentially saying with certain limits of money, you have to transfer some basic PII information over with that money, right? And this is assuring that, again, those anti-money laundering and sanction busting things aren't being abused. So basically you're saying, oh yes, I know this person, it's this person transferring this amount of money, right? And it's very minimal information, but it goes to that financial institution. So that way both the sender and receiver have that same amount of information, and they can go perform that check and give a thumbs up or thumbs down if it's good. So there is a regulation that happens with fiat currency, with your normal money, that for this to happen, but cryptocurrency being so new, there wasn't. Now that rule is actually, I believe, still supposed to be enforced, but like the SEC and things have not been enforcing that because cryptocurrency is so new. So Coinbase was trying to kind of get ahead of the game and saying, we need to kind of come up with a solution to do this because blockchain and cryptocurrency doesn't account or allow for this. So they put together this, and now there's 30 plus companies, I think, that contribute and work together to kind of make this happen. So that's kind of an interesting story and some behind the scenes things of how things happen that I wasn't necessarily aware of or informed about before. And this is really just kind of wrap up. So kind of through the threat modeling, when I came out with this, right, and sat with the team, went through all of this, they were really kind of impressed from the perspective of, wow, you really did your homework. You came back with these meaningful results of where we need to focus on, where we need to prioritize on, and this is where we need to invest our money on and take our tech debt and kind of do this, right? Similarly, everyone in security was like, okay, now I understand where our strengths and weaknesses are, where we have crypto SMEs and where we don't, where maybe we need to do additional crypto-specific testing and maybe we don't, right? This is really kind of was an eye-opener to the whole product, right, of where we need to focus on. As a threat modeler, establishing all those relationships is kind of a long-going thing, right? Now I found that, oh yes, these features are coming out. They're coming to me saying, I want you to work on this. I want you to focus on this, right? So get engaged early, right? As I mentioned, try to move your program down to getting engaged during the design and development phase. You're going to build these relationships. You're going to be thankful because they're going to understand the ROI. Because if you come to them so many times with more tech debt, they're going to get frustrated. But if you start to turn that around and saying, this is why, they start to understand and say, okay, the developers might be cranky because they're just trying to crank out code. But believe me, the leadership and the project managers and the product managers all will be thankful and understand. The real challenge, as I mentioned, is kind of measuring that ROI. What was influenced? What was changed? How can I put a dollar value on that? That's something I'm constantly tweaking and trying to come up with. If I can say, hey, I saved 1, 5, 10 vulnerabilities, I can kind of work backwards and say, well, this is how much each of those phases costs. Once I start to show them that number, everyone gets really excited because they're like, wow, we know that was a positive thing. We know where that came from. So that's all I had. I think there's plenty of time for questions if anyone has any, but thanks so much.